Hello again and welcome back to another video, and today we are looking at a scenario where all of East Asia unites. For this I'm including only East Asia, not Southeast Asia, as that would be far too powerful in my opinion, at least to begin with. So we will be including the nations of China, Mongolia, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, and if you recognize it, Taiwan. Immediately this is going to become most likely still the second most powerful nation in the world, still being a trillion or so behind the US when it comes to economy, but by far having the largest population in the world, being 150 or so, probably more than that, ahead of India, despite the fact that India has passed up China alone. Adding in the populations of North Korea, South Korea, and Japan will boost it enough to surpass India once again, possibly for good, but most likely not forever. Immediately this would change the power dynamic in the world immensely. The second and third most powerful economies have conjoined. North and South Korea, along with China, have joined, giving this nation the second most funded military and the largest military by number of personnel, and also the largest reserve force in the world. These may not be exact numbers, but this is just stuff that is fairly clear to me looking at this. This would be the second most powerful nation in the world by far. And one thing it would most likely do to the US is ruin American dominance, as without Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, they cannot fulfill their plans of blockading China in a future war. And by adding in all of the strength of mainly South Korea and Japan, this nation's military might would be still, once again, not on the level of the US, but far surpassing Russia for second. Navally as well, in real life, the South China Sea is still technically a contested area, but in this scenario, China would most likely be able to secure their own dominance over it, as although this isn't actually just China, this is a mainly Chinese-controlled group of nations. Japan is a very strong, powerful state, but compared to China, it is still not the strongest. The same goes for South Korea. So they would nearly immediately be able to secure naval control of the South China Sea, and they would also attempt to expand out from Japan to ensure that the Americans would have a very, very hard time breaking this Chinese naval dominance in a future war. They would then start to buddy up with the Philippines, and by that I mean they continue to push their navy southward until they reach basically the Filipino coast. And from there, they would stage their navy right outside of Vietnam for some possible future operations. Those future operations would begin now, as the Americans cannot stop this absolute behemoth from starting this war. They would begin a war fighting with Vietnam, the most powerful country in the region, which now completely goes against this Chinese dominance and is attempting to align itself with the US. They naval invade the south, the center, and begin an attack in the north, completely cutting it off from the world, while at the same time staging what can only be described as coups in Laos and Cambodia to secure these nations for themselves. They would continue the invasion of Vietnam until eventually they are bogged down by Vietnamese guerrilla fighters. They will start to know what the US was struggling with during the Vietnam War, but with more naval invasions and complete aerial superiority, along with starting to attack out of Cambodia and Laos, the Chinese would eventually win. When it comes to actual land grabs, there wouldn't be very much. Perhaps a small amount of northern Vietnam, or a part of the coastline, could be somewhat realistic. But overall, they could not fully annex the nation. Instead, they will set up a puppet government to further secure their influence over this South China Sea. With these new allies, they will expand their influence all the way to Malaysia, which is their real goal. Malaysia is still the one country who could completely destroy the Chinese economy by cutting off the Strait of Malacca. I think that's what it's called, yes. Indonesia could do it as well, but Indonesia is not currently as big of a threat as Malaysia is, as Malaysia is far more American aligned. With that, they start a war of control with the Malaysians. The Americans consider getting involved, but due to this new Chinese strength, they are being unable to secure basically control of anything. They cannot, if they join this war, they would not be able to secure even naval dominance in the region with their incredibly powerful navy. This would not be a war, this would be an absolute slaughter of Malaysia. The Chinese would naval invade the main island and, well, the main peninsula and the Malaysian part of the island, Borneo. Borneo would swiftly fall. It might have some jungle, but this would not be Malaysia's priority, and as they know they cannot defend everything from the Chinese, their priority would be their main peninsula. Even with this being their priority, soon enough their capital falls, and they will capitulate. In the peace treaty, China will actually directly annex the tip, along with the point where it is narrowest, to even further cement their control of this strait, basically telling Indonesia to back off or they will kill them. They then puppet the rest of Malaysia to cement their influence in the entire region. They expand their naval control into neutral waters, and this is when the US finally, despite knowing that a war with China would probably not be the best for either side, puts its foot down and decides that the next war will be the last for one of them. This could be quite a dumb move, but we have yet to see, as China continues to expand their naval dominance into the entirety of the South China Sea. Along with this, controlling the Borneo part of Malaysia, they start to encroach on Filipino waters, so that if a war ever does break out, they can immediately control the entire area. And soon enough, that war will break out. China decides that their final threat from the Americans in the area is the Philippines, and they declare war. We are also going to be assuming that no nuclear weapons exist in this timeline, because that would kind of just destroy everything. Immediately, the Americans would join in, with support from practically all of their allies and most of the world. Some of them may join in themselves, but since this is technically an attack on the Philippines and just the Americans trying to defend an island, it could be possible that the Americans would be far more alone than you would expect. They would still be getting much of the global aid, and despite the fact that China holds much of the global economy now, many nations may still embargo them out of basically fear of Chinese dominance over the entire world. Although the Americans would not be in this war for very long, the American Navy would quickly begin to secure their control over the Filipino areas, but it really would not be enough. Without having allies in Japan or South Korea, it would be significantly harder to control these areas, as they have to ship them all the way from Australia, who agrees to provide them with full naval access. They have to go all the way around to reach the Australian coast, where they can resupply and hold down the fort. This is most definitely not a good position for the Americans, as this is directly in the Chinese backyard. Meanwhile, the Americans have to move everything halfway across the world, and they can most likely not even get the troops necessary in here for a while. Let me just show you this American lane, which is mainly how they're getting their supply over there. They may have full control of their coastlines, and China knows this. They know that no matter what they do, they cannot destroy the American Navy or economy. Their main goal here is to kick the Americans out of Asia. As in doing so, the Americans may not be able to once again reemerge in the area, giving the Chinese full control to do whatever they want. America does still dominate the Atlantic and the, I guess, East Pacific as well, though. Let's go ahead and begin with the Chinese Navy starting to encroach on northern American waters. They begin an assault into neutral waters to attempt to overstretch the Americans. This goes well as the Americans are getting pushed back further and further, especially in the north, where the northernmost island of the Philippines is now exposed, including their largest city. The Chinese managed to naval invade and capture most of the land. The American troops are still being unable to arrive, and the Philippines are quickly falling. Despite guerrilla tactics being used, the Chinese are now more used to this than ever, and they manage to continue to secure their influence over the area. Indonesia is soon enough forced to support the Chinese in this matter and help blockade American troops by not allowing them to go anywhere near their waters. Meanwhile, the Chinese use it to resupply and dock their own ships. They continue their assault on the American Navy, as having no places to resupply nearby, once damage is taken, it cannot be stopped. The Chinese Navy continues to encroach on the American one until eventually they get close enough that they can resupply and hold. This will not be close enough to stop the complete and total collapse of the Philippines, though, as despite the superior American Navy, China has successfully kicked it out and has now captured all of the Philippines. This is where the world would finally decide that China should not be allowed to do this. And by that, I mean we have India joining in. Why is this? This is because China had been pushing for all territorial claims that they could have possibly wanted against the Indians, now that they have control over practically the world at its fingertips. They call in Pakistan, and this has now turned into a full-on Asian war. With Indian entry, casualties will skyrocket. The Chinese quickly begin to push down into the Himalayas, knowing that if they can just cut this off, Indian troops will have a very hard time, as Bangladesh and Myanmar both pledge, I guess, their allegiance to China. China also begins a push into northern India, and Pakistan begins a push into southern India. This Pakistani push should not last for very long, as soon enough Indian troops begin to arrive and push them out completely. Along with that, the Indian army begins a counteroffensive into Pakistan, capturing much of the south. From here they continue to push until they capture the major city of Karachi. This causes the entire south to fall, as Pakistan is now very much so struggling to get help. Luckily for them, they have China on their side, who, despite being struggling themselves, especially economically, has still managed to cut off the Indians and capture much Indian land. They then begin an invasion through Bhutan and Nepal, and although this is hard, it does still lead to some minor Chinese victories through the Himalayas. This is where the Americans finally decide to start their counteroffensive. They manage to gain control of much of the Pacific and continue to get closer and closer to Chinese waters. Their goal here is to keep themselves at least somewhat off of this Chinese land, making it look more like they're going for the liberation of the Philippines, while in reality they have a much larger goal in mind. The second most important region of this East Asian nation is the Tokyo region of Japan, and that is where they're going for. They focus absolutely everything they have and manage to gain full naval dominance in the region. As soon as the Chinese realize this, they attempt to resupply, but the Americans, who have now given basically everything they have, along with most of their allies sending their own troops and navy, technically officially as volunteers, but truly as men, they managed to capture the city of Tokyo, the largest in the East Asian nation, and one of the most important in the world. This is absolutely devastating for the Chinese, but it will not last for very long. Soon enough, this Pacific War, which had mainly been localized, has now been expanded into neutral countries' waters, as everyone wants to gain the advantage. And the advantage is once again going to be in the American favor as they begin to push the Chinese back towards the island of Taiwan and the northernmost island of the Philippines. They managed to capture these islands right here, which I forgot the name of, which they use as a naval base and an air base to prepare for an invasion of southern Japan and possibly even China. This is where the Chinese do manage to stop them, though, as the Chinese have now at least started to hold on to whatever territories they have left. Thus, the great stalemate begins as China begins to force troops down the Americans' throats, slowly tearing away at them. They use their reserve and their own currency, along with their own influence, to cut off the Americans from much global trade and absolutely demolish the value of the dollar itself, turning the world's currency into multiple other ones depending on where you are, and much less so the dollar. The Americans, though, despite these massive hits themselves, managed to continue to make progress along the Japanese coast, which is still their most major objective. And despite Chinese resistance, they managed to capture Nagasaki and naval invade most Japanese islands. This is absolutely terrible for the Chinese. They are now losing some of their starting territories, and they absolutely need help. They go to the Russians, who agree to give them access, but that may not even be enough to stop this American onslaught. It does, however, allow them to further secure their influence in the North Sea, or at least in the northern Pacific, where they will prepare their next attack. The Americans, who had been too busy fighting in Japan, are completely unprepared when the Chinese decide to do to the Americans what the Americans were doing to the Chinese. Sneak up their entire naval force. Most Chinese divisions are pulled out of conflict in Japan, just barely leaving enough to keep the territory under contention. Meanwhile, they decide to send the bulk of their forces over to naval invade Alaska. May not look like that's very close, but that part right there is actually the part of Russia. And they begin a naval invasion of Alaska. After getting a small foothold, they continue to push down into more and more Alaskan islands, hoping that if they can capture enough territory, the American public may feel bad enough about this war to pressure the American government into capitulating and giving up completely. Of course, they are underestimating the public's resolve here, but this is still an absolute loss for the Americans, as without any Alaska naval bases, or at least any of importance, the entirety of the North Pacific is now under Chinese control. Despite this, the Americans will continue to make progress in Japan, hoping that they can stop the Chinese before they capitulate the entire state. This will fail, and all of Alaska will fall, although this is not as bad as you may expect, as whatever American troops that were there were just sent into Canada, and Canada is now considering officially joining into this war. This isn't great for the Chinese, but seeing as they have completed all of their objectives, they do not care, and soon enough Canada will join into this war, changing just about everything. With Canadian entry, the Chinese are going to have a much harder time holding on to Alaska. Meanwhile, the Americans will have a greater international aid, as this is now seen as less so of a conflict between China and the Philippines, which the Americans joined, and more so everyone just trying to stop China before they got too strong. Despite the supply in this region is bad for just about everybody, and the Chinese managed to use their massive manpower force to push into Canada. From there, they are stopped, however, and they now decide to refocus on India. In Japan, they have been steadily losing land. Now, the Americans have naval invaded Hokkaido and continue to push out from their landing in Tokyo. They make more landings, and soon enough, the entirety of the Japanese islands are under American control. Along with this, all waters surrounding Japan are now under American control as well. Americans have truly shown the Chinese that throwing men cannot save them, especially after the Chinese embarrassed the Americans by managing to capture Alaska. Following this, once again, the Chinese decide, you know what? We can't keep fighting a two-front war, and they start a major push into northern India, until eventually they manage to capture New Delhi, the largest city in India, and much of the northern plains that are where India gets its manpower from. Pakistan also manages to push back south, as India really has no support. Russia has secured its allegiance to China, and although the US is trying to get aid in, it really is struggling, as most African nations are siding with the Chinese, along with Arabian nations, including Iran. China is securing their sphere, and they will continue to do this by staging basically a complete takeover of Myanmar, allowing them to further put pressure on the Indians to just give up some northern lands and give up to a smaller nation, which will be significantly under the influence of China. The Indians really do not want to do this, but once the Chinese manage to finish breaking through the Himalayas, along with capturing West Bengal, the Indians finally decide to agree to some form of compromised peace, seeing that they are getting destroyed here and that they will not last very much longer if they do not give up. For now, India will just stay a semi-occupied state with their own government and their own personalized rule, despite Chinese forces being present in most major cities. From this, China decides to ignore everything else and attempt to recapture Japan. This will go fairly well, as they manage to regain some naval access to the southern island, and the Americans start to struggle as they are getting less and less international support. Europe is still firmly on their side, but Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, all of Asia, most of Africa, Indonesia, and even parts of South America are now allying with China. It is the Western world versus the rest of the world. And the West is failing, as without imports from other nations, they cannot continue. The naval invasion in southern Japan goes very, very well, as the Chinese are set on recapturing this very, very important territory. The Americans are pushed out of Tokyo, and now the Chinese are just starting the long slog into northern Japan. Now, from here, there may be some kind of compromised peace, as all sides are tired of fighting, but seeing as this video is getting long, I believe I'm going to be making a part 2 that I will probably post later today or tomorrow. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.